Well, I'm disappointed that I couldn't be in Montreal together with you today, but we're busy in the UK trying to deal with hurricanes that we've never had before. So we're on our own new Anthropocene island over here as well. Um, I hope you'll permit me just to make sort of some more general remarks at the beginning that I'm sure will be old hat, but allow me to tell the story that I want to into the final parts of the paper. So I'll start with that. Uh, as we all know, norms are a core aspect of global environmental governance regimes. Normative expectations regarding integration and coordination of international policies have been pursued through a variety of forms. And in this talk, what I want to focus on is the notion of normative convergence that has come around the idea of governing through goals, as I think Klaus spoke on this morning. We're now all familiar with various kinds of goals. Perhaps most salient, perhaps, are the Millennium Development Goals and their successors, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs in particular have ignited interest in whether goals are good to govern with, and if so, what kind of norms might be conducive to their use as a mechanism for integration or for coordinating action. For many, the concept of a basic foundational Grundnorm that situates life with respect to a safe operating space for humanity has become a central feature of discussions regarding how international law and governance might be oriented to the Earth system. What I want to do in this paper is bring two strands of thought together. The first is that the evolution of international organizations and institutions has been both compelled and constrained by social conflict and struggle. That is, it's not the outcome of the long march of reason. The second strand is that the new spirit of capitalism, and here I'm referencing Boltanski and Shapello, the new spirit of capitalism that now dominates the global liberal order is itself very adept at incorporating, outflanking, and often internalizing critique as it marches us ever further down the plank of growth. So with this in mind, I want to situate goals as the latest iteration in a broader project of integration in the global liberal order. This project, I believe, will be likely to outflank appeals to notions of a Grundnorm as some sort of empirical boundary. And indeed, I'll argue that it already has done this. So to situate goals within projects of liberal integration, I'll contrast them with two previous periods. One, following on Michael's talk, a notion of state-based integration, and the second, a notion of rules-based coordination. So to begin with the state model, here, and I'll begin with the obvious caveat that exactly where the state begins and ends is going to remain up for debate. But nevertheless, in this iteration of the liberal order, perhaps the most globally influential model of integration and of coordination was the Tennessee Valley Authority in the United States. The TVA ultimately became the international model for coordinating development in the post-war era. As James Scott remarked, in the early development years, to think development was to think of the TVA because the model was so prominent. The TVA, of course, was created in 1933 to maximize social well-being within the limits provided for by water. Hydraulic potential was captured by dozens of dams, coal-fired electricity plants dotted the landscape, and the facility at Oak Ridge provided a steady supply of plutonium for America's emerging nuclear arsenal. 3 years after the creation of the TVA, the United States formalized one of the earliest articulations of cost-benefit analysis as part of flood control legislation in 1936. And the combination of these two factors, on the one hand, organizing regional development, and on the other hand, measuring integration based on cost versus benefits, became two central pillars that were emulated routinely in the state-led dynamics of environmental governance in the post-war period. Together, they reinforced the form of liberalism that was trumpeted as America ascended to global status, and also as it claimed its own experience as a model for post-colonial development. And here, of course, they ignored the fact that the US is a settler colonial state that's itself built on the dispossession of indigenous peoples. Now, various social conflicts plagued the state-led model. Anti-authoritarian movements among feminists and environmentalists pushed for alternate forms of governance, including the practices linking science to policy. Development programs largely failed in the attempt to remake the global economy to accord with theories of modernization. And in response, and again, to permit my generalizations, a second period emerged in response to these critiques of state-led initiatives. And this was a position based on using a rules-based system of integration and coordination. This period also captures two things at once. One is the rise of market-based forms of integration, where critiques of state inefficiency provide rationale for pursuing market-based reforms, structural adjustment policies led by international financial actors, and backstopped by economic discipline were one side of a double-edged sword. The other side was the rise of new norms touting transparency and responsibility for an era of good governance that was pushed for also by financial institutions like the World Bank. These forms of free market environmentalism, combined with devolved forms of governance, reached a crescendo in the 1990s alongside the rise of sustainable development agendas after the Earth Summit. Alongside this rise was the devolution of decision-making from formal state-led endeavors into a variety of governance initiatives that expanded the type and role of actors involved in decision-making. Both market reforms and the rise of governance were rule-based forms of integration in the sense that both rely on states to set up rules for integration. Markets require rules ensuring clear title and fair institutions, while consensus-based governance exercises require rules for fair procedures regarding such norms as participation, transparency, and cooperation. Indeed, many programs arose where the extension of economic instruments, such as land titling, were seen as the best way to ensure cultural protection in places like Latin America, Southeast Asia, and more recently in Canada, where there continue to be projects to privatize First Nations land. Rule-based integration, of course, was itself a compromise between debates over limits to growth that shaped the modern sustainability agenda. Yet it is no particular secret that property rights, of course, are frequently inimical to achieving justice and often environmentally pathological. So these agendas are now being pursued through a different normative platform for achieving integration, that of governing through goals. The historical trajectory from state-led to rule-based forms of integration is instructive for understanding the norms at work in the current era of governing through goals. It's a well-trodden path, for instance, to discuss the different forms of utilitarianism that have taken shape over the past century of environmental policy. The famous extension of John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, first made by American conservationists, extended the greatest good for the greatest number to the notion of achieving this for the greatest time, or for the longest time, in their words. Many of us are also familiar with the outcomes, both nationally and internationally, of pursuing this form of bureaucratic utilitarianism. Conservation agencies, both national and international, ministries of the environment, interjurisdictional agreements, and the like. The running roughshod over Indigenous people and informal economies that got in the way of these bureaucratic processes also produced a kind of social indifference in the name of orienting resource policy to political economy. And the shift to rule-based strategies for integration likewise came with an ethical shift from a bureaucratic form of utilitarianism to an individual form of utilitarianism. Here, the rational individual actor became the central site for executing the utilitarian calculus. In the case of market-based pursuits, this was Homo economicus, a figure now much maligned, of course, by ecological economists and others. Alternately, proponents of deliberative democracy vaulted a kind of linguistic master who, through the sheer force of argument, shapes environmental decisions that maximize the good or adhere to deontological principles. But this figure has likewise been heavily criticized, notably as the sort of unencumbered self that Michael Sandel revealed to be at the heart of procedural liberalism. The social conflicts that ensued from failures of rule-based regimes has led squarely into the new era of governing through goals. We are witnessing, I would argue, an era best described not as bureaucratic utilitarianism or individual utilitarianism. Rather, we're entering an era of systemic utilitarianism, where consequences and actors are required to conform to a mutually interacting economic and environmental system. This system, these interacting systems, are no less idealized than were rational state bureaucracies or the individual monads of economic theory. The core difference, however, is that the norms for coordination and integration are assessed against the dynamics of the Earth system, not the standards of individual, social, or political obligation that formerly provided the basis for either rights-bearing subjects or sovereign states. The form of the Earth system in goal-based governance is highly idealized when it is made to function as a site for integrating and coordinating law, ecology, and economics at the scale of the Earth system. Those of us familiar with this sort of idealized system could easily imagine eavesdropping on a conversation at midpoint. In this scenario, we may well hear discussions of risk, resilience, thresholds, and tipping points, but it might be some time, however, before we could determine if we were eavesdropping on a conversation between economists or ecologists. Are they discussing the collapse of global fishing stocks or the plummeting prospects of global financial instruments? It's very difficult to say. The core assumption that has been augmented, though rarely articulated, is that where formerly we pursued integration and coordination, we have now achieved a form of integration between the Earth systems and human economies as a material fact. Yet, of course, this form of integration provides for possibilities that are nothing of the sort desired or that progress had promised. Indeed, this is one of the central challenges of the Anthropocene. Here, I would argue, is where the turn to goals is able to mobilize the new spirit of capitalism, the spirit in which critiques are turned into platforms for further economization of the material and energetic throughput of the planet. We do not have to look far, as Melinda Cooper has so eloquently shown, to see how in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, it was precisely through ecological notions of resilience, thresholds, and complexity theory that the global economy began to align risks to profit and accumulation with those to climate and biodiversity loss. Moments of crisis, it turns out, are not only profitable, but also perfect platforms for turning boundaries into opportunities. It is worth noting that even among some of the foremost Earth system scientists, such as Johan Rockström, resilience and complexity present right moments for aligning the Earth system with the economic system so as to achieve what he calls abundance within planetary boundaries. This idealized Earth system that comes with new formats of governing through goals also creates a new utilitarian format for ethical pursuits. In it, the integration of complex systems is a precursor to maximizing the good. Systems thinking demands that the constraints imposed by planetary boundaries become as natural to integrative goals as progress was to states and rules. Liberal promises of abundance, of opportunity, are repackaged as closing windows that we must quickly pass through as a condition to maximize utility in some new horizon, in the case of the SDGs to 2030. Carbon budgets are the most obvious example, but there are numerous others at various scales. Ethical intractability is part of a shifting set of governing mentalities that further winnow away at the basis for critique in the use of goals for international norms. Notably, ethical intractability, I think, will undermine appeals to what others have called the Grundnorm. It is exceedingly difficult, for instance, to track and weigh all the consequences of the multiple supply chains of material or energy that supplied your lunch that you just have, or which will supply my dinner when I get home this evening. We can do it, no doubt. That is, we can trace our systemic effects, but we are highly unlikely to do so. Instead, we are much more likely to use some sort of calculative metric, such as our ecological or energetic footprint, thereby subtly shifting our ethical obligations from personal responsibility to a calculation of a systemic effect where we let the consequential chips fall where they may. That is, they get distributed through the system. But so long as the system overall is good, then the ethical obligation has been met. The normative legitimacy of governing through goals depends on accepting a new kind of systemic utilitarianism in which the pursuit of the good is constrained by a particular and highly stylized view of the Earth system. In this context, goals translate uncertainty into systemic risks to the economy. To do so, goals come with certain goalposts that are more or less arbitrary if viewed from the perspective of the system. The SDG window, for instance, of 2015 to 2030, has no intrinsic normative content. It only makes sense normatively if this period is seen as consequential to the Earth system. And my argument is that the way in which it becomes consequential has caught us up with a new iteration of utilitarianism that has moved us from bureaucratic forms to individual forms, now to systemic forms with no substantive change to consider other ethical options for coordinating governance or law. Thank you.
5 minutes then for comments or questions.
I have a question. Thank you for that talk. It was very interesting. I'm sorry, it's Michelle Maloney. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Michelle.
I was just wondering if your critique of things like Earth system science and having objectives and goals, what is your alternative?
Sorry, could you just repeat that? I just missed a bit of it.
If your paper is critiquing, obviously I haven't read the whole thing, but if it's critiquing a goal-based approach to Earth governance, what is your alternative?
Well, I thought academics were supposed to kick up the dust and then complain that we can't see through it. That was my first lesson in philosophy.
I just wasn't sure if you had a conclusion that said so. Instead, we should do something else.
Yeah, I think what ultimately the sort of work that's going on in this network is the kind of work that we need to do by looking for ways to not get outflanked yet again by the ability of particularly the kind of liberal order that we are in now to internalize critique. I think that's one of the main strengths that it has. And I think here some of the key focuses that we need to take and where I think we need to be looking is on where some of these core concepts are really being articulated between science and policy. So the big institutions that seek a lot of power and influence, particularly I'm thinking of places like at the World Economic Forum, where notions of risk and resilience are really being used to combine certain ideas of ecological and economic systems. This, I think, is probably where we need to target a lot of our work because it's such a stylized view of how the planet functions. Right? So I'm not against, of course, understanding human impacts on the Earth system. I think this is vital, but I think it's vital that it's not co-opted. So I think we need to be very clear, first of all, about what goals actually do, whether or not we should be governing through them. Right? I think that these goals form a function that is, and I'm still in this very preliminary work, the goals form a function that gives a kind of, forms a function kind of like a boundary object that you would get in science and technology studies, where it permits significant disagreement and ambiguity while being a moment for consensus as well. Right? So if you set your goals far enough or strategically enough, then you're into a certain type of policy game. And I think this is the one that we want to be confronting. It's totally unclear why we should orient huge economic systems to 2030. Makes almost no sense. Unless you really are willing to accept a certain account of crisis from the perspective of the Earth system. Right? So this, I think, is a big normative challenge for environmental governance, particularly, and I think to sort of link to Michael, sorry, this is an extended answer, but you're kind of thinking on my feet about something I hadn't considered before. But I think to connect maybe a little bit to what Michael was just discussing, is that one of the things that happens with the shift to resilience-based notions of pursuing goals is it has a very strong effect of undermining the kind of rights-holding subject that was typically assumed at the basis of international, say, human rights. Right? The resilient subject is somebody who's already interdependent, which we typically assume is good, but who lives also in a world conditioned by constant change, right? So ecological systems are constantly changing, they're not stable. And so the notion that we should be having maximal flexibility to govern these sorts of subjects in these kinds of communities, because that's the kind of system that they work in, and we'll have an economic system that goes along with it, really leaves levers for rights in very different places. Right? What sorts of subject is now holding the right? Is it this intersubjective one that empirically we're now pursuing? Or is it one maybe we don't entirely love, but the one that has some lever to hold states to account based on duty-bound principles? And that's one of the reasons that I'm critiquing it as an extension of utilitarianism in a new guise, because I think this is what it does, is it asks us to keep looking for how to maximize the good of a system, and this comes at the expense of other ethical alternatives.
Yeah, very interesting talk. Question on sort of institutions and processes. What sort of institutions do you see democratizing this in some way, and or the processes be used to take what the trajectory you see and actually turn it in a way that makes some sense? I think of things like the tours, Parliament of Things, where a bunch of scientists get around to talk about matters of concern. I can see them setting sort of goals, large set of goals. So have you thought of the procedural implications of this in a constructive, in a critical way?
In part, I suppose I'm just starting to grapple with where you're already probably a few steps ahead of me. And the reason being is that in my own research, what I find is that the current moment of returning to things or materiality that we find in, say, someone like you referenced, like Bruno Latour or others, this is a moment that already happened when we turned the page into the Holocene. Right? Exact conversations about agency of the planet and so on were very popular in early 20th century anthropology and geography, all of which were used very explicitly by the Roosevelt administration to install conservation programs at that time. So what my concern is that these turns to trying to understand broader notions of agency risk the exact same thing. Right? That in the use of goals, they're already being given a liberal spin, right? In terms of the kinds of liberal order that they're designed to fit with goals. I mean, so what sort of procedure counters that? I think is two. One, I think, is to look at the other side to see what kind of social conflicts and struggles have actually been forcing this system to evolve and iterate over time, right? So I think taking Indigenous refusals, to give one example, much more seriously, to say, a lot of people say Indigenous refusals, have helped to show the failures of colonialism, right? In Canada, for instance, right? The project of colonialism in Canada fails in a lot of ways because Indigenous people refuse it over and over and over again in the face of pretty serious odds. And I think that giving priority of place to these sorts of struggles is sort of a core procedural move that says what we're not trying to do is say that this system is iterating in a way that is rational or coming up with better solutions. What I think we want to do is say, what have been the mechanisms that have forced it to move already? And which ones of those can we amplify? And to me, people like Latour do not do that. I find him to be a very conservative thinker. So I don't see him doing that.
No, I agree with that.
Thank you very much, Jeremy and commenter questioners.